Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Frederick Crews, who is Professor Emeritus of English at the University of California at Berkeley and former chair of the English department there. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His 12 books include Skeptical Engagements, nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award, The Critics Bear It Away, American Fiction and the Academy, The Memory Wars, Freud's Legacy and Dispute, Unauthorized Freud, and The Random House Handbook for Writers, which is in its 6th edition. Professor Crews, welcome back to Berkeley.
Glad to be with you.
I welcome you back since you're emeritus. Where were you born?
Philadelphia, suburban Philadelphia. Neither the main line nor downtown.
And what were the major influences in your younger years? To what extent did your parents influence you?
Oh, I think they influenced me tremendously. They were both readers. They'd both been raised in considerable poverty, and books had been extremely important to them personally in shaping them. My mother was very literary. My father was very scientific. I feel that I got a little something of both sides.
And what sort of books did you read as a young person that you can recall today?
Well, if you go all the way back, I read about nothing but sports when I was, 11 or 12 years old. I used to read the same book over and over because it was good enough for me. It was called Blocking Back. And I remember my horror when at the age of about 35, I discovered that the initials in the name of the author of Blocking Back disguised a female author.
So at that time, you weren't ready for the shock of that realization.
No, I was raised in the traditional American youthful atmosphere of sports and competition.
What about important mentors? Before you move on to college, did you have any important mentors that really influenced you or shaped your life?
I had one, and that was my tennis coach in high school, who was also my math teacher, who perceived that I had a brain. And this was when I was about a junior. I had been goofing off in high school considerably, trying to amuse my friends to keep them from beating me up. And he thought that I was wasting my time, and he told me so. And, he gave me good intellectual lessons as well as tennis lessons, and I'm tremendously grateful to him.
Were you an athlete in high school?
Yeah, I was the co-captain of my tennis team. I played tournament tennis in high school, but I could never even make a high school team if I had to do it all over again today. The quality of tennis is so much better.
And where did you do your undergraduate work?
At Yale.
And what about your studies there? Was it in English?
It was in English, although this was 1955 when I graduated from Yale. I entered, for the first 2 years, something called the Directed Studies program, which required us to distribute our courses among sciences, social sciences, literature, philosophy, and so on, but with a coordinated faculty, so each of them knew what the other was doing. And it was certainly the greatest experience I'd ever had up until that point, maybe the best ever. And to get to college and realize that I could devote myself to ideas and be, rewarded for it was to me amazing and wonderful.
Now, did this complement your childhood in a way? You said your mother was very literate and literary, and your father was a patent attorney.
That's right. I think my parents' influence over me is something that I only gradually realized. I mean, for example, when I came to write my dissertation at Princeton, and I got my degree there in 1958, PhD, the topic of my dissertation was E.M. Forster. Well, he happened to be a favorite author of my mother's. I'm not sure I ever consciously put that together when I chose Forster, but obviously it was an important factor.
And you mentioned that your father had more of a scientific bent and your mother more of a literary one, because that seems to be a bifurcation or the two worlds that you engage throughout your career.
My father always hoped I would be a physicist or a mathematician, but he was a good sport about realizing that I didn't have the aptitude. I now regard scientific training, or rather training in scientific thinking, as an essential part of education. And oddly enough, I succeeded in ducking it to some degree in my directed studies work at Yale, because the courses that we did have to take in science weren't the bread and butter courses. They were humanistically presented. And in a way, I never really got a full confrontation with scientific reasoning. I had to figure it out for myself much later.
Now, in graduate school, you did your degree at Princeton in literature, you were saying, and any books in particular influence you during that period?
Well, I have to say that when I was an undergraduate at Yale, it was in the heyday of the new criticism, and I was trained in those principles of formalistic analysis. When I went to Princeton, I came up against something called Christian humanism that dominated the spirit of the English faculty, and it was quite antithetical to new criticism in various ways. But I found neither of these orientations particularly engaging to me personally. So I found that most of the influences on me that seemed to matter were being brought in from the outside. I remember in particular I was reading writers like Dostoevsky, Nietzsche. I began reading Freud. I thought that the methodology in which I'd been trained was extremely tame and wasn't getting at whatever it was that was exciting me about literature.
And so you were reading this stuff on the side?
Yes.
Or, yes.
Yeah, I was. Of course, an author who was important to me at that time was Nathaniel Hawthorne. And before I got my PhD, I had published a paper on one of Hawthorne's novels. Then later, when I was out here for a while and I published a couple of other books, I went back to Hawthorne. And it was Hawthorne that drew me very close to Freud. Because it struck me at the time that Hawthorne and Freud had an uncanny likeness of outlook, and I still think they do. But the key inference that I drew in the early 60s was that the resemblance between Hawthorne and Freud could only be explained by the fact that Freud was onto a correct way of looking at human psychology. That sent me off in a direction that I repented of, have been repenting of for a long time. And much later it occurred to me that Hawthorne and Freud resembled one another because they were both part of the same broad historical movement, namely Romanticism, with its introspection, its sense of the divided self, secrets that one hides from oneself and others, and so forth.
And this notion of the closet romantic, both in yourself and in many of your colleagues in English department during the later struggles, is a theme that appears again and again in your work.
Well, yes.
Okay. So now the key question is, let's go back to your career a little here. You come to Berkeley. Is that the first job you had and then you stayed here?
It's the first and only job I've had. My resume is about that big.
So part of what your work is about, in a way, is coming to terms with this romantic self and marrying it to scientific discipline. Now, the question I have for you is, do you think it mattered a great deal that you came to Berkeley and stayed here, which is a place both for protest and for a citadel of science?
Well, the protest was an important part of my life because I was an anti-war activist from 1965 to about 1970. I ceased being an activist when the Republicans became activists. I figured I could relax at that point. But this happened to coincide with the period in which I was conducting graduate seminars in psychoanalytic criticism and privately wondering about the basis of psychoanalysis as a system of thought. And it might just be a funny coincidence, but about the time that I reverted to a kind of garden variety liberalism in my political outlook, I also lost faith in this other form of radicalism, this intellectual radicalism that was psychoanalysis. And I should say that psychoanalysis as an institution isn't radical in the least. Nothing could be more establishment in this country. But in the academy, in literary studies, up through most of the 1960s, it was a very unusual and controversial point of view.
As I looked at some of your work, I drew a conclusion about you, and I would like to have you relate to my thoughts about you and disprove them if they're not. You seem to me to be a literary critic, obviously, but also a liberal and an empiricist. And so I'd like to parse those words and see if they're meeting in your particular case. In the Critic Spirit way, you speak of your concern for understanding American literature with as few allusions as possible. What did you mean by that?
Well, of course, that's a book about what I consider to be methodological dead ends that have been taken from the late 60s until that book was published, 1992. And it's ironic because part of that methodology is definitely psychoanalysis. The fact that I got off the trolley didn't slow the trolley down at all. My work had been somewhat influential, but when I recanted it, the recantation was not the least bit influential. Psychoanalysis as a methodology kept going. Meanwhile, it got combined with various currents of thought from France chiefly, Western Europe more generally, currents that can be summarized in the word post-structuralist, deconstruction, Foucault, Derrida, all the rest of it. And by the time I wrote Skeptical Engagements, 1986, I felt that literary criticism or literary theory had become extraordinarily top-heavy and dogmatic, that on the one hand, theorists thought of themselves as very skeptical, to the verge of nihilism, certainly a kind of epistemic nihilism, where they felt that they were taking nothing for granted. And on the other hand, they were relying on doctrines like psychoanalysis that were highly orthodox and full of a priori unexamined assumptions. And it seems to me that if you want to do justice to literary art, you have to clear away this underbrush and try to look at the works not only for themselves, but in their social and biographical context without all these assumptions.
So in a way, it's about the facts and relating them to reality. I was struck when push comes to shove, the several themes of your work come down to exposing, and I quote you here, the fear of facing the world, including its works of literature, without an intellectual narcotic at hand.
Yeah, I like that sentence.
Yeah.
I'm glad I wrote it.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, why do we read literature? We read literature because it gives us things that we can't get from any other source. We can't get it from paraphrases. We can't get it from theory about literature. The writer is out there on the edge of something, trying to do something that is new, that is unique. And if it's a great writer, you owe that person the respect of being ready to respond to that which is new in the work. But all of this theoretical background serves to anesthetize you against exactly that risk.
Now, the second adjective that I applied to you was liberal in a classic traditional sense. And you say somewhere, I think it's in the Critic Spirit way, I value singular departures from established belief and practice, even when these efforts produce clouded results. The best novelists themselves have been liberal in this sense, courting isolation and incoherence in the hope of making something new.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, think of Melville, for example. Think of just how deeply opposed he was to the spirit of his own time, and how lonely he was, and how many years he spent really with writer's block, because he felt that he no longer had an audience, and that the audience he had misunderstood him as a kind of popular travel writer. His greatest works could not be understood in his lifetime, but instead of repudiating them, he fell silent, at least as a fiction writer, until the very end with Billy Budd, when he wrote another one of these great, tragic, highly ambiguous works that doesn't toady to anybody's values. It's an expression of his own vision of the way things are, and it's just tremendous.
Now, if you're going to get at that accurate knowledge about Melville, let's say, what skills do you need? What materials do you have to look at?
You have to know the corpus of his work backwards and forwards. You have to know what he read. You have to know the philosophical sources that interested him. You have to know the temper of his times. You have to know the political issues that he was engaged in. You must know his biography, but above all, you must learn to catch the way his mind works, to figure out the characteristic way in which he puts thoughts and words together. And nobody can help you do that. It's just a question of you and the text.
So that in a way, your isolation, loneliness, and courage in a way in looking at an author could be said to mirror that author's own courage, isolation, and loneliness in creating his work.
Well, that's a pretty heroic way of looking at somebody just doing what he was going to do anyway. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've always loved books, and to get paid for teaching books was a treat for me. It's nothing particularly courageous about it.
Well, but one could make the argument that had you continued your Freudian studies in the sense of doing Freud as opposed to critiquing him, that might, what you just said, might hold true. But it is the case that you had been teaching a graduate seminar on Freud for 4 years. You were perceived as a student training future students of Freud, and you completely broke. So
that's true.
That is different.
No, that is true. And okay. That's one of the reasons I make Freudians uneasy, is that I have been on their side and thought it over and decided not to be any longer, which means either I made a correct intellectual decision or there's something terribly wrong with me psychologically, and you can imagine which alternative is preferable to them.
That's right. Now, the key tool in your journey, so to speak, is the scientific method and your commitment to empiricism in the work that you do. Explain that to us, how in literary studies one adopts that methodology and undertakes one's studies.
Well, the phrase the scientific method is kind of a red flag. Most philosophers of science, virtually all philosophers of science today, would deny that there is such a thing as the scientific method in the sense of an algorithm that leads us to correct results in our propositions about the world. That was the dream of logical positivism, and it's been exploded. So scientific method in that sense is certainly not what I have in mind. What interests me is general rationality, of which science is a part. And general rationality requires us to observe the world carefully, to consider alternative hypotheses to our own hypotheses, to gather evidence in a responsible way, to answer objections. These are habits of mind that science shares with good history, good sociology, good political science, good economics, what have you. And I summarize all this in what I call the empirical attitude. It's a combination of feeling responsible to the evidence that is available, feeling responsible to go out and find that evidence, including the evidence that is contrary to one's presumptions, and responsibility to be logical with oneself and others. And this is an ideal that is not so much individual as social. The rational attitude doesn't really work when simply applied to oneself. It is something that we owe to each other. We submit our ideas to each other in a way that enables them to be clear enough, non-contradictory enough, to be accessible to refutation. And that's as true of propositions about literature as it is of propositions about quarks and protons.
Now, let's talk a little about the academy during your career and whether those principles that you just enunciated retain their vitality in the humanities. I guess you would conclude that they didn't. So I want to know what are the strengths and the weaknesses of the university insofar as it tolerates dissent and creates a discourse which is rational.
Well, of course, the university exists to court differences of opinion, but principled differences of opinion. What's happened in the humanities is a general assault on the very idea of the empirical, the very idea of the rational, which are now associated with such social evils as racism, patriarchy, and so forth. And in the vacuum that is created by this denigration of the empirical, nothing is left but cliquishness. Nothing is left but power. And this can all be put very concretely in terms of tenure decisions. A person submits a body of work for evaluation to be so that he or she can be retained for the rest of the career or fired. On what basis is this work to be evaluated? Well, if there isn't a critical mass of tenured people who believe in the empirical attitude, then the work can only be evaluated according to whom it pleases, whose interests it pleases. And then it's a question of what clique you belong to and what kinds of fashionable references you're willing to make. And I must say that in my 36 years of teaching at Berkeley, I saw a changing of the guard in this direction that was very disturbing to me.
So the university then creates systems that don't handle dissent very well, you seem to be saying.
Well, I think the prevalence of originality and individuality in the university has always been somewhat exaggerated in any era. There's always a lot more conformism among these people who regard themselves as unique than they're willing to admit. But I think there's been a qualitative leap in the wrong direction in the last 20 years.
Now, how do we account for that? At one point, I think in skeptical engagements, you suggest that in addition to the exercise of power and the gratification that comes with choices associated with power, that also at work was a surfeit of graduate students. Yes. And a concern about, well, what is there to study?
Precisely.
Hasn't it all been studied?
No, precisely. This sounds very cynical, but I sincerely believe that the economic crisis of the academic profession, especially in the humanities, has had a powerful methodological effect. If there are fewer and fewer places for graduate students to occupy in the profession, if there are more and more graduate students pursuing fewer and fewer places, a premium has to be placed on the sheer production of discourse. A general unspoken fear comes over everyone that discourse is being used up, that the things that are worth saying have been said. And what this does is to place a premium on methodology that will loosen the constraints upon discourse. And certainly this is what psychoanalysis is largely about in the university. Psychoanalysis is a beautiful system of seeming rules which are actually licenses to arrive at prearranged conclusions in multiple ways. There are multiple paths to a conclusion one has already reached, but at no point are there constraints which threaten to decertify one's a priori belief. So the methodology acquires a value in and of itself as a free-for-all, as a hermeneutic free-for-all. And that's why empirically based objections to such a system of thought fall on deaf ears in the humanities.
And you suggest in looking at Freudianism, and I think you're also suggesting at some point in your comments about graduate programs in English, that this fits very nicely with the need to perpetuate the movement or the subfield within the discipline.
I'm not quite sure I know what you mean by the movement.
Well, in other words, in the case of Freud, basically the self-validation, the closed system contributes to what the movement achieves, which is its own perpetuation, not as a scientific study, but rather as a validation of Freudian psychoanalysis.
No, I do agree with that, and I would generalize it to characterize psychoanalysis itself. That is to say, psychoanalysis, under the guise of curing people of mental ailments, has been essentially a movement that replicates itself and whose central purpose is to replicate itself. Or as I once put it, it produces more converts than cures.
Let's talk a little about Freud. We keep coming back to that. Help us understand better how and why your thinking about him changed. And at one point you say in one of your books, I know for myself, however, that my disillusionment with psychoanalysis occurred in minute stages over many years. You've given us a sense of that, but is there anything that you would like to add?
Well, sure. In the academic year 1965-66, I had a handsome fellowship. I had an ACLS grant, and I also had a residency at the social sciences think tank in Palo Alto. And allegedly, I was broadening and deepening my acquaintance with psychoanalysis. But what actually happened is that I came up against a lot of very sharp people, most of whom were not believers in psychoanalysis, and some of whom very helpfully sent me out to read dissenting opinions about it. And I did that reading, and I would like to be able to say that a light bulb went off, and I said, oh, God, this has been a terrible mistake. Instead, I went back and started teaching my graduate seminar. That's when I did, as soon as I returned from Stanford. But in the back of my mind, these doubts nagged at me, and they continued to grow for about 4 or 5 years. By 1970, after 1970, I couldn't offer that seminar anymore. I had too many reservations. But even so, if you read the things that I wrote in the early 70s, you'll see that I was still struggling to hang on to something in the psychoanalytic vision. And it wasn't until 1980 that I completely washed my hands of the last hope of that kind. I think for me personally, this is an important fact that it took me so long, because what's said about me in psychoanalytic circles is that I had the kind of sudden conversion that characterized Stalinists who then became Cold Warriors. No, it wasn't like that at all.
And a lot of your reading dealt with the philosophy of science, or had you done that in an earlier period?
No, I had not done nearly enough of it in an earlier period, and I think people like Karl Popper was extremely important to me, Ernest Nagel, Sidney Hook. a few others. I remember in particular there was one article by Nagel in a book that Hooke had edited, I think, 1957, 1959, don't remember the date. But it was just a methodological critique, no more than 10 or 15 pages. But it was absolutely unanswerable. Since it was unanswerable, I tried to turn my back on it. And then I found that I couldn't.
Now, what were your other reference? In other words, I gather you began reading extensively materials on Freud that were increasingly critical of the way he had practiced as a physician and a psychoanalyst.
Well, as it happens, the so-called revisionist movement in Freud studies began right around 1969, 1970, with works by Paul Rosen, Henri Ellenberger, Frank Chaffee. And this movement grew to be something really quite spectacular, in my opinion, with, for example, Frank Soloway's major book of 1979, Freud, Biologist of the Mind, Adolf Grunbaum's The Foundations of Psychoanalysis, 1984, and then, of course, the publication of the uncensored Freud Fleece Letters of 1985. The implications of these studies are still just beginning to be felt, but they are quite revolutionary. And that's why the last book that I did was an anthology of revisionist Freud studies, to try to give the general public a sampling, the general literate public a sampling of this absolutely stunning new knowledge of the difference, the gap between Freud's claims and what he was actually experiencing and doing at the time that his claims cover.
And so it was more than he was a bad scientist. In some ways, he was a charlatan.
He was a charlatan. In 1896, he published 3 papers on the etiology of hysteria, claiming that he had cured X number of patients. First it was 13, then it was 18. And he had cured them all by presenting them, or rather by obliging them to remember that they had been sexually abused as children. In 1897, he lost faith in this theory, but he told his colleagues that this was the way to cure hysteria. So he had a scientific obligation to tell people about his change of mind, but he didn't. He didn't even hint at it until 1905, and even then he wasn't clear. Meanwhile, where were the 13 patients? Where were the 18 patients? You read the Freud Fleece Letters and you find that Freud's patients were leaving at the time. That he didn't, by 1897, he didn't have any patients worth mentioning, and he hadn't cured any of them, and he knew it perfectly well. Well, if a scientist did that today, of course he would be stripped of his job, he would be stripped of his research funds, he would be disgraced for life. But Freud was so brilliant at controlling his own legend that people can hear charges like this and even admit that they're true, and yet not have their faith in the system of thought affected in any way.
So what is the way that he succeeded then?
He succeeded in presenting himself to the public through a highly organized propaganda machine, by the way, which is what he turned the International Psychoanalytical Association into. He succeeded in presenting himself as the personification of a certain kind of Nietzschean courage combined with scientific rigor, ascetic responsibility that was attuned to the spirit of the times, namely anti-Victorianism. The Western world was ready to overthrow a very tired-looking, Christianizing moral order and to give more sway to the instinctual side of life, sex in particular. And Freud portrayed himself as a person who reluctantly but courageously faced the twin demons of sex and aggression. And like Prometheus, or like some other Greek god who goes into the underworld, he came back to earth with these pieces of dangerous knowledge, and he tamed them and made them accessible to us so that we can now be cured of our neurotic ailments, thanks to him. He turned himself into a god, a kind of man-god. And people fell for it, and at a certain point I fell for it.
There were particular ways and instruments by which he even moved beyond the power that came from being suitable for the time, so to speak. I mean, literally, he established a small group that would put out disinformation about those who opposed his theories.
Well, that's right. The group was called the Committee, and it consisted of his closest associates, people like Ferenczi and Jones, just a handful of people. They had a secret ring. They had a kind of blood oath, and their mission was to propagate Freud's ideas, but specifically whatever ideas Freud felt were proper at the time, so that as Freud's views changed, their views changed. And what they did was to slander his enemies and to prevent them from having access to the relevant journals. Jung, I think, was the very first victim of this movement because it was formed in response to the threat that Freud perceived from Jung's dissidence from him around 1912. The whole thing went on until about 1926 in complete secrecy, and its existence was not acknowledged until about 1940. But it was a propaganda apparatus, and a very, very successful one.
So that in many ways, and you point this out in, I believe, Skeptical Engagements, that there are similarities between Freud's movement and the communist movement.
There certainly are similarities, and it goes pretty deep because ultimately Freud and Marx are twin theorists of the unconscious. For Marx, we are unconscious of the interests that shape our consciousness. We don't know, we think we have these ethical values, but what we really have are our class interests based on our position in the structure of manufacturing and ownership. For Freud, the unconscious is that which harbors our shameful instinctual life. And so our conscious life is a compromise between these feelings that we can't acknowledge and all of the influence of the superego which tries to deny it. Well, if you take these two views of the unconscious, you'll find that both of them cast ordinary people in a very belittling light. Ordinary people are not aware of what's truly motivating them. They need to be told what's motivating them, which means they need to be ruled. And if you read Civilization and its Discontents, which is, I think, the most overrated book ever written, you will find Freud talking about America and its democracy and how what it really needs is a strong central leader. The people seem to think that they know what they want, but of course they don't. They can't rule themselves. It's an unruly country. And I find it fascinating that Freud's politics lean toward this authoritarianism that is ultimately implicit in the theory itself.
Now, interestingly enough, I called you a liberal at the beginning, and I have a quote here from you. You speak of your notion of learning as involving keen debate, not reverence for great books, historical consciousness and self-reflection, not supposedly timeless values, and continual expansion of our national canon. You're talking about American literature, but in other words, the very things you just described about Marx and Freud go against that, really. They're trying to stifle debate, in a way, as they offer this narcotic about the forces that are gripping either the mind or the world.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. Even though Freud and Marx both were cultivated people who enjoyed and appreciated the arts. So the primary influence of their authoritarianism wasn't exercised in the field of commentary about the arts.
Let's move away from Freud and talk a little about great writers and distinguished writing. What are the characteristics of distinguished literary writings? Or is that too gross simplification?
Yeah, it's very, very hard to say, precisely because the great writer, and one always thinks immediately of Shakespeare, is the one who's least explainable in terms of his contemporaries. You know, you can read Marlowe and Shakespeare, who were writing the same kinds of plays at the same time, but there's a qualitative leap there that is almost indefinable, but we all feel that it's there.
Now, does it go back to what we quoted you as saying earlier? The best American novelists have made singular departures from established belief and practice?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, Faulkner, whom I certainly had in mind when I wrote that sentence, is a good example. And Faulkner was a very confused man. Faulkner's views on race are nothing to write home about. He didn't know which side of the fence he was on. But out of his confusion, he wrote extraordinarily powerful fiction that was highly empathetic. What Faulkner could do was to put himself into the body and mind of a black man or a white man or a woman with equal facility. This is genius at work. There's no explaining it, and certainly there's no formula for reproducing it.
Now, and this would explain to us why a critic has to place an author in his own personal history and in the history of his times, really, to come to an understanding of the issues that he's grappling with.
Well, yes, if you want to find out what's unique about a writer, you're obliged to be well acquainted with his or her contemporaries, for sure. And you know, in general, a literary critic wants to understand what's there. And it isn't just understanding what's unique, it's understanding the whole package. Perhaps the author is conventional. Perhaps the author is terribly overrated, because when we get to know the contemporaries, we see that it's not as new as we thought it was. Well, let the chips fall where they may.
And part of your struggle is to come to terms with overcoming the author's own representation of himself.
Certainly, people in general do not understand themselves terribly well, and there's no reason to think that an author is transparent to himself. This being so, however, we still want to be wary of methodologies which give us the idea that we will know in advance what the deep secret factors are. We don't know that in advance.
In your meta-criticism of the critics, one of the telling points that you make is they're so engaged by their own theory, that they really want to put aside the facts of a particular life.
Well, yes, or more typically, they will light upon a fact or a handful of facts that are particularly congenial to the theory at hand, and then these facts become the only facts. You know, the great intellectual model, perhaps the most influential intellectual model in the humanities in our time, has been the work of Foucault. And this is exactly what Foucault did with history. He brilliantly amplified the significance of out-of-the-way facts, which he then took to be the essence of the whole civilization, or the whole segment of time that he would call an episteme within the civilization. He did not have an empirical frame of mind, and if you'd asked him about it, he would have agreed with you. The empiricism is old-fashioned. It's not the way to go.
And presumably his followers would be ones to confirm his conclusions as opposed to evaluating them in light of different theories.
Well, yes. I mean, again, in this empirical vacuum that I have described to you, the citation of intellectual authority becomes a substitute for reasoning. And to cite the so-called correct authorities, not always politically correct, but the ones who are current at the moment, is a large part of what is required if one wants to be taken for an intellectual. Whereas my view is almost exactly the opposite. The appeal to authority can never be satisfactory, even if the authority is right.
Now, part of your job as an educator is to teach students to recognize these myths and illusions. And one of the ways they can go about doing that is learning to write. And for many years, you were the head of the freshman composition program here. And as I pointed out, you're the author of the Random House handbook. So let's talk a little about writing. Can we learn to write well, and how do we do that?
Well, I got through graduate school so quickly that I had never even been a TA. I got my PhD in 3 years, and then I was just told to start teaching freshman English here in 1958. I hadn't the faintest idea how to do it. Wasn't even told which books to assign. I was just kind of told to go in there and do it. And the kids that I was teaching were not much younger than I was. I was 25. And I found this tremendously exhausting and challenging, but also very exciting. And I was almost like one of these little goslings that Conrad Lorenz writes about. You know, I got bonded to freshman English. And I never ceased loving the teaching of composition. Later, when I went through some of the intellectual changes that I've been discussing with you, I started up a course called Practical Writing that was for everybody but English majors. They were not welcome. But with a sequence of sessions between myself as a lecturer and specially trained TAs from other fields, we had social scientists and humanists and hard scientists all doing writing. And we were all talking about the same general topic, which was precisely rationality and rhetorical presentation. And that was one of the most exciting courses I ever taught. I did that for several years in the 80s. But back in the 70s, I decided to write a composition handbook for a number of reasons, some of which were just very personally practical. And I found that it was a lot more fun than I thought it would be, because I found that one could use better literary examples, and one could even create whimsical characters who had a kind of plot line going through the book. So this book was quite different from the usual fare that was being produced in that genre, and it was very successful in every way.
You make a point in the introduction to the Random House, which I would like to ask you about. You tell the student you must realize that effective prose is not like a brass ring at all. It is more like the destination of a journey, approachable by steps that anyone can follow. And then you go on to say, we do not have things to say. We acquire them in the process of working on definite problems that catch our attention.
Yes, well, I believe that profoundly, and I make the statement to freshmen because freshmen tend to come in believing that they do have things to say. And they've already experienced wonderful things that they want to tell you about and reached wonderful conclusions. And what they've experienced generally is what their classmates have experienced, which isn't a great deal. And what I want to tell them, what I've wanted to tell them is that the things that are really exciting are the things that you don't know yet, but that you will find out if you grapple with a real problem in a way that opens your mind to objections to your first thoughts about that problem. And the sign that this is happening is the struggle over drafts with prose. If you find that your first drafts are perfectly adequate, it means that you're an egotist, that you're in love with your words. Experienced writers become increasingly suspicious of their own drafts and even suspicious of their own enthusiasm for their drafts. And they try insofar as possible to critique them themselves, but if they're really lucky and they have some honest friends or relations who are also intelligent, They submit the work to criticism, and they listen to the criticism and are inclined to believe the criticism, because more often than not the criticism shows them something they did not want to see about their own work.
You state that your philosophy of education, I think this was in the Critic Spirit way, is to make our students, quote, more capable of independent judgment by teaching them to read accurately and to write scrupulously in a comprehensible idiom. Our own prose can be an example in this regard. We can also mediate between relatively uninformed readers and great works of imagination, holding out alternatives to a life of passive consumption and manipulation.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's what teaching literature ought to be all about. And by the way, that's why I always preferred teaching undergraduates. Even when I was surrounded by acolytes among graduate students when I was a Freudian, the undergraduate teaching was always more exciting for me, simply because you had minds that were more ready to be changed, that were not pre-professional.
Didn't have the theories down.
Didn't have the theories down. You know, in my last years as a teacher here, I found increasingly that the graduate students understood the profession better than I did. And I thought that was terrible. Mm-hmm. I thought that they should postpone this kind of canny insider knowledge of the way the departments work as long as possible, but they seemed to know it when they came in. It's a kind of premature shrewdness which shuts down intellectual options.
I always try to end these interviews with lessons learned. It's a hard thing for anybody to do, but look, if we look back at the 20th century, one sees the power of many bad ideas, and you've latched on to demonstrating that with regard to one in particular, psychoanalysis. What would you advise students as they face the 21st century and the charlatans that will undoubtedly appear?
Well, it's not so much advising students as advising their instructors that the students should be exposed to the practice of reason. The students should be given the opportunity to choose between alternative ideas on the basis of evidence and logic. And I think there are very few courses that are offered, including in the sciences, that do this. Most introductions to the sciences give the student an acquaintance with the present state of the field, but not with the criteria that make one idea more appealing than another to a given scientist. So I think we as educators need to elevate rational and empirical values to a higher place in the curriculum than it generally occupies.
And where do you think that kind of teaching, what discipline will it come out of, or will it have to be interdisciplinary?
I think it can be done in just about any discipline, but I would also envision interdisciplinary efforts by master teachers. I mean, I think of someone like John Searle, who's such a charismatic teacher. He could do a wonderful course in exactly this kind of thinking that would be open to the whole freshman class. It would be given in the Greek theater.
One final question. The contribution of the humanities to a liberal education is in decline. Is that a cause of concern to you?
Well, it's a cause of tremendous concern to me. I think our whole culture is becoming rapidly more technocratic and more materialistic. I think that money counts for more in the minds of students than it ever has before. Job security counts for a great deal, and you can't blame the students for that, but you can notice that it's the temper of the times. The idea that one's undergraduate years are a time of intellectual exploration is disappearing. Specialization is becoming earlier and earlier. I don't think the replacement of books by television and the internet is such a hot idea. So yes, I think that the decline of the humanities is very, very bad, And in my own life, I have felt that the free reading that I did, as well as the assigned reading that I did, have stood me in very good stead in all kinds of ways that I couldn't possibly have anticipated at the time. There's a storehouse of history and culture there in the back of your mind, which gives you a basis of comparison, a way of distancing yourself from the hurly-burly around you. And if I've been able to resist the pressure of conformity to trends, I think it's partly because I did get a pretty darn good exposure to points of view that were not my own and were not those of my time. And somewhere or other, they're part of my mind. And I think in the best of all possible worlds, everybody should have such opportunity.
Professor Crews, thank you very much for joining
you.
us today and talking about your intellectual odyssey. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.